So anyways, we'll start out with this review. We know that Enoch started and grew up in a time before the flood, of course. And as Brother John was saying, the angels were the symbolic heavens and stars at that time. Brother Johnson said to us that they were actually the authorized teachers of the people, rewarding them for their obedience and punishing them for disobedience. This was before they sinned and went against God's order and started to marry with women. We learned that there were no human governments, as the scriptures point out, that the first human government was organized by Nimrod from Genesis 10 and 9 and 10, which says, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. We also learned that the earth was not divided up into private property at that time. This was done in the days of Peleg, divider, after the flood. Genesis 10:25 states that, and unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. Now, we also learned that the very first business transaction that appears in the Bible was, and was on record in the Bible, was when Abraham purchased the field of the cave of Machpelah, which is in Genesis 23:3-20, which I will not read today. Now, we learned a few things about Enoch, also that he was born and he basically lived for 308 years while Adam was still alive. So there's a really good possibility that he spoke and conversed with Adam. For 308 years, that's quite a while. I really don't think that they never ever met. He was the seventh from Adam, of course, and he lived for a period of 365 years, walked with God, and then he was taken. 57 years after he was taken, 57 years after Adam had already died. He was taken way before Noah even was born. Now in Genesis 6:24, we learn of these giants that were created by the angels breeding with the women. And in Genesis 6:4, it says there were giants in the days of in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, and became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Those giants, and the word giants here was translated from the word Nephilim, were men of renown, men of wonderful ability and sagacity above the fallen Adamic race. They were a hybrid race, the result of the new vitality united to the Adamic stock. Today, we have our own giants, which are the corporations, which are, according to the law which are, according to law, living beings with the same rights as people. And this is true in the United States. The actual law in the United States says that they are living beings, and in other countries too. So with these modern corporate giants, they were great, powerful, and cunning to an extent which discourages the thought of their being conquered without divine interference. Now, the conditions of the flood, of the world before the flood, Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. This implies that the majority of Adam's posterity had already become greatly contaminated and more or less a new race by association with the angels in human form. The giants of today threaten the human family. as the literal giants threatened it over 4,000 years ago. Now, as the giants of the world that was before the flood were swept away in the flood of the waters, so these corporate giants are to be swept away in the coming flood of fire, the symbolic fire of God's jealousy. And this was stated to us by our brother Russell. In Luke 21:36, we read, "Watch ye therefore and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and stand before the Son of Man." Here the Bible implies that the little flock would escape the tribulations of the time of trouble. But Brother Russell gives us some other thoughts on that. We quote from Brother Russell's manna text from December 3rd. "Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world, to try them that dwell upon the earth." This is from Revelations 3:10. Brother Russell's comment was, "This is a special reward for those who are running the race with patience and endurance in the present time, in the Laodicean period. While it was not our privilege to escape the hour of temptation, it is our privilege to have a counterbalancing special blessing as a result of living in the time of our Lord's parousia, his presence." So why are some of the church still on earth during this time of trouble? Well, it was because they basically lived on. Even Brother Russell lived for 2 years when the time of trouble started, till 1916, the First World War has started. And Brother Johnson himself lived right through the First and Second World War, and even through the Great Depression. But John 16:33 basically says the same thing as what Brother Russell had said. "Abide in the world. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but in me you shall have peace." Luke 21:28 also he stated, and when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. He, Enoch, seems to type, and this is what we learned from the last discourse, that part of the church that does not have to sleep in death and await the resurrection. That is, those saints who would be alive and remain after Nisan 1878, when the sleeping saints were awakened. And this was a direct quote from Brother Johnson. So from Enoch typing the little flock, that part of the church that does not have to sleep in death and await the resurrection, we can surmise that it was fitting that Enoch would be taken away before the flood, which destroyed the wicked world. He was spared the wickedness which ensued as a result of the fallen angel. But where was he? He was taken way before even Noah was born. So obviously he could have been taken somewhere, some remote part of this earth. We're not quite sure. The North and the South Pole were, as far as we can see, were tropical climates. So he could have been taken to one of those places where no man had gone yet. We're not quite sure. What we are sure of, though, is that if he was taken and lived on past the flood, where was he taken? Jesus' own words prove that he didn't go to heaven. And there's a lot of Christians who believe that he was taken to heaven, but he was not, because in John 3:13, Jesus stated clearly, "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven." Did he go to another planet? We are not quite sure. When someday, I guess in the kingdom, we will learn that. So what happened to Enoch if he did not go to heaven and did not die? Brother Johnson answers this question in volume 6, pages 271. Thus, the scriptures teach us that Enoch and Melchizedek are the same person, and the following is the proof. St. Paul says that of Melchizedek it is witnessed that he liveth, and that is from Hebrews 7:8. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witness that he liveth. So there is nowhere in the Old Testament where it is witnessed that Melchizedek lived on without dying. Enoch in his own is the only human being who the Old Testament witnessed that he liveth, according to St. Paul's explanation. The Old Testament says in Genesis 5:24, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And St. Paul confirms the scripture in Hebrews 11:5, where he says, by faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. So here the word translation, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the word that it was translated from, but the word translated and translation used in this verse express the thought of transferred or carried across, that Enoch was still alive on this side of the flood. Genesis 5:24, if we review this again, we see that it says he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. And then from 11:25 in Hebrews, by faith God was translated. Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Hebrews 7:8, of course, says, and here men that die receive tithes, but there he, Melchizedek, received them, of whom it is witness that he liveth. So here, Paul is stating that Melchizedek is witness that he liveth. Yet the only man in the Old Testament that it is testified and witnessed that he liveth was Enoch. So obviously, St. Paul had the Spirit, and he knew that Melchizedek and Enoch were the same, because this is the only one that it is witnessed that he liveth, was Enoch. So, and he stated this about Melchizedek. So obviously Melchizedek and Enoch are one and the same person. So in conclusion, therefore, these passages prove that Enoch and Melchizedek are one and the same person. Now there is more proof. They being the same person, we have a record which Jude testified of Enoch's prophecy, that the Lord and the saints would come to punish the sifters of the parousia and epiphany. Jude 1:14 and 15. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, and these saying, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And so here it's showing that Enoch prophesied of these 10,000 saints that would come. Now, perhaps this was in the book of Enoch. I haven't read it, so I couldn't tell you that for sure. But when you only use the Bible, this is the proofs. There is no record of Enoch's prophesying in the Bible. So when did he express these prophecies? Enoch did not express these prophecies in words, but in the symbols of the pyramid, which he, as Melchizedek, built. We know that it was the general consensus of all our beloved pastors that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built by Melchizedek to its completion in 2140 BC, which is long before Joseph was taken to Egypt. If we look at the timeline here, we see that the completion of the Great Pyramid was in 2040 BC, which was 332 years after the drying up of the flood. Enoch, or Melchizedek at that point, would be 1,366 years old. Manetho, a 3rd century BC Egyptian historian, himself an Egyptian, wrote, "There came up from the east a strange manner of men, of an ignoble race, who had the confidence to invade our country and easily subdue it by their power without a battle. All this invading nation was styled Hyksos, that is, shepherd kings." He then related how afterwards they departed for Judea, or probably Canaan, and built a city there named Jerusalem. This was long before the Exodus of Moses. So again, when we look at this timeline here, it was from this period of time when he finished the pyramid, Melchizedek, this 95-year period, that he built that city of Jerusalem, which at his time was called Salem. Now, concerning the shepherd kings, here's an extract from John Taylor's book, The Great Pyramid. Why was it built and who built it? He wrote, "They came into the country as strangers. They were not of the same religion as the Mizraim, the Egyptians, who preceded them in its occupation. They did not invade it as conquerors, though, as Manetho tells us, they easily subdued it by their power without battle. They must therefore have come either in such large numbers as to make opposition hopeless, or they must have been received as benefactors, like angels, like mighty men, by their common people whom they employed. And it was only after their departure that their memory was calumniated, or in other words, it was smeared and denigrated by stories told of their oppression. They were evidently animated by a desire to perform a certain task, and when they accomplished it, they left the country of their own accord, confiding to the care of the original inhabitants those wonderful works, the pyramid, by which they had enriched the ennobled the land. They employed a common people in realizing their magnificent conception, for which they must have given them the most minute direction, and this evidence superiority of intellect may have caused the ignorant to envy and misrepresent them. In the Watchtower 1907, April, page 126, in the article Behind the Frowning Providence, in the section called Another King Who Knew Not Joseph, our dear Pastor Russell wrote, in Joseph's time, and for quite a while before it, had been governed by what were known as Hyksos, or shepherd kings, supposed to have been invaders and not pure Egyptian stock. From the time Jacob entered Egypt until the Exodus was 215 years. This was a time when there arose a new king, which knew not Joseph. Excavations made in Egypt show that it was about this time that the government of Egypt was revolutionized. Genesis 14, 18, and 20 speaks about Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, or Jerusalem, which was the original name for the city Jerusalem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And he gave him tithes of all. This sounds like Melchizedek gave Abraham tithes, but it was Abraham who gave Melchizedek tithes. And this is declared in Hebrews 7, 1-3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Without father, without mother, without descendant, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually. Now this here part here, without neither having beginning of days, nor this, how could he not have a beginning of days? There's only one being in this entire universe that did not have a beginning of days, and that was God himself. Even Jesus had a beginning. So this must have meant that his beginning, there was no record of it. So we don't know when he started out. But because this is speaking of Melchizedek, but we know Enoch had a beginning of days. But Melchizedek, we don't know when Enoch became Melchizedek, nor end of life. So this here confirms the fact that it was said of Enoch that he should not see death, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now the question arises, who did Melchizedek type? Melchizedek is spoken of as having greatness that exceeds Abraham, who paid him tithes and received blessings from him. Hebrews 7:7. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed by the better. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Melchi, king, and Zedek, righteousness. He was the king of Salem, which is king of peace. Salom means peace, and was the short term for Jerusalem. So this is from Hebrews 7:7, and without all contradiction, the less is blessed by the better. Melchizedek typed Jesus, who was the greater. Jesus, antitypical Melchizedek, was first the king of righteousness. And so we look back again at this timeline here, and we see that it was approximately let's see here, I'm not sure exactly, it was 427 years after the flood that Abraham was blessed by Melchizedek, because it was very short before the covenant, around the same time as the covenant that Abraham met Melchizedek. And in 1461, that's how old Melchizedek or Enoch would be, 1461 years of age. And here you look here, how old, if he kept living on, how old he would have been after the Exodus and after the division of Canaan and after the periods of the judges and the periods of the kings, and all the way up to AD when Jesus was born. He would have been 3,506 years old. So here we see that some people say that Melchizedek became Elijah because Elijah had no, there's no genealogy on Elijah. And there's a possibility of that. There's some people that believe that perhaps Enoch became one of the little flock members, but there's arguments against that and for it, because he did represent as Melchizedek, that Christ, Jesus, and that he would be a king forever. But some say, well, no, he was part of the ancient worthies. Whatever it is, we were promised and told by God that he would not see death. So regardless of whether he became a little flock member or whether he will become a ancient worthy, you see that he maybe lived on, and he's still on this earth somewhere or on some other planet, being preserved by God and living on. In 2022, he would be 5,528 years old. And if he became a little flock member and lived on until the time after 1878, he would have been changed in a twinkling of an eye when he finally did die, and he would have not seen death either. And so I just want to show you a couple little cartoons that my son made for me, which I thought were kind of funny. And here we see Melchizedek holds a pep rally before the final lift of that headstone on the pyramid. And here we see one where he did a thing about Elijah. Elijah's was being served dinner by the ravens, and here he is a raven serving Elijah dinner. And so may the Lord add his blessings.